listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Once terrorist group ISIS made regular headlines overseas and in Australia, where fears of an attack loomed large. But in recent years, stories about the group have dropped out of the spotlight. But out of sight, out of mind doesn't mean the group has disappeared. And over the weekend, Donald Trump ordered the US military to conduct strikes against ISIS targets in Somalia. So is the group having a resurgence?
One of the ways that they've been able to do that, to stay alive, to keep propagating their vicious idea of holy war and to keep grabbing new recruits to replenish and replenish and replenish, is their mastery of the message.
Coming up in the second half of this episode, we speak to someone who knows a lot about the group and the region, having himself survived a near beheading by them. First though, let's get into the headlines of the day with Chris Spiru. It is Monday, February 3rd.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Labor has imposed counter-terror sanctions on a neo-Nazi group amid growing pressure over a rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has announced the move against a group called Telegram, an international network of groups which promotes white supremacist content and calls for violent acts to destabilise society. It is the first time an entirely online organisation has been hit with sanctions under Australia's counter-terror laws, making it a criminal offence to use or deal with the assets of the platform, with breaches punishable by up to 10 years jail and heavy fines.
This comes ahead of the first sitting day of Parliament for 2025, which happens tomorrow. And Peter Dutton is tipped to grill Anthony Albanese over his government's response to anti-Semitism. So this is being looked at as a way for the government to say we are taking decisive, strong action against the problem. Now, this could very well be the final sitting fortnight before the federal election, with Labor also tipped to bring forward an announcement about childcare subsidies in order to get it passed before we head to the polls. And the opposition leader too is tipped to face some heat in the House of Reps. And this was after he revealed he planned to take an axe to government spending, but he wouldn't say exactly what he'd cut until after the election.
If we find wasteful spending, our intent is to cut it, and that will result in, obviously, an overall reduction in government expenditure.
That was on the ABC's Insiders program. Expected to be cut as many as 36,000 jobs in the public sector that the coalition claims have been created under Labor. So this is going to be our first taste of the Pollies sparring face-to-face in 2025, Chris, ahead of the election, which looks like it's going to happen early April.
Heavy rainfall is expected to continue drenching Queensland's north for at least another day as thousands flee from floods that have already claimed a life. Premier David Crisafulli confirming a woman died in floodwaters in the town of Ingham after a rescue boat struck a tree and flipped on Sunday morning. Parts of Townsville have recorded more than a metre of rain in recent days, while further north more rain is expected for Cairns, Innisfail, Gordonvale, Babinda and Redlynch. Thousands are experiencing power and water cuts. Essential services like elective surgery have been put on hold, flights to the region cancelled, and around 100 schools will remain closed this morning. The Premier telling Queenslanders under evacuation notices to pack their bags and leave, describing some of the rainfall and river rises as historic.
Over to the US now, where Canada and Mexico have hit back against Donald Trump with retaliatory tariffs, a move experts warn marks the beginning of a trade war. So this follows the US president signing an executive order this weekend imposing 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada and 10% on all of those coming from China. Now, specifically, energy imported from Canada, including oil, natural gas and electricity, will be taxed at a lower 10% rate. The response has been swift, Mexico's president immediately ordering retaliatory tariffs, while Canada's Prime Minister announced matching 25% tariffs on certain goods. Justin Trudeau saying it will affect 155 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, ranging from beer and wine to fruit and veg, household appliances, furniture and sporting goods.
I want to speak directly to Americans, our closest friends and neighbors. This is a choice that, yes, will harm Canadians, but beyond that, it will have real consequences for you, the American people.
Now, in a post to Truth Social, Trump said the tariffs were necessary to protect Americans, pressing the three nations to do more to stop the manufacture and export of illicit fentanyl into the US and for Canada and Mexico to reduce illegal immigration into the US, Chris.
Yeah, interestingly, we're yet to hear from China how they will react to these, whether they're going to impose retaliatory tariffs. That is a real possibility that we're just going to have to wait and see what happens there. So I think a lot of people are wondering what is going to be the real world impact of all of this. It is important to know that most goods can move between the US, Mexico and Canada tariff-free because of Trump's US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. But mainstream economists are generally skeptical of tariffs, considering them a mostly inefficient way for governments to raise money and promote prosperity. And that really boils down to the idea that consumers are the ones that end up getting lumped with covering these fees.
Yes.
Trump, though, he thinks it will drive domestic production and manufacturing of goods into America and bring manufacturers back to the States. He's encouraging global manufacturers to open plants, warehouses, in the US. He's thinking it's going to create more factory jobs, shrink the federal deficit and lower food prices.
Yeah, the problem is this is all going to take time because think of, some big factory that's been operating out of Mexico and going, yep, let's set up in the US. You don't just pick up a factory and drop it into the Midwest and go, all right, here we go, people, let's go. It takes time. And this is why he has warned the American people that this is going to hurt them in at least the short term, potentially for years down the line. On Truth Social, he said, will there be some pain? Yes, maybe, and maybe not. But we will make America great again and it will all be worth the price that must be paid. This is what he neglected to mention during the campaign trail. All he went on about was tariffs. I'm going to lower your grocery prices and I'm going to bring in tariffs. And everyone's like, yay, this is amazing because this puts America first. But he didn't talk about what the short-term effects are going to be. And like I said, potentially for years into the future, it is going to hurt people who are trying to do business in the United States, Americans trying to do business in the United States. Look, we also heard from Jim Chalmers, the Australian Treasurer, over the weekend about what the impact could be to us here in Australia. While that's not clear, obviously, you mentioned that economists are predicting a potential trade war at the top of this story. We don't know, though. We don't know exactly what the flow-on effects are going to be. But Chalmers did say that they've been working behind the scenes in government and that we're in a, quote, good place to deal with potential flow-on effects.
And the Grammys are on today, kicking off at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time with Trevor Noah hosting for the 5th year in a row. This is the first awards night in LA since the devastating fires earlier this month, with organisers promising to raise awareness and funds for those affected.
This ain't Texas. Ain't no hold'em.
This year, Beyoncé leads the nominations with 11, the most nominations in a single year for a female artist. She's also won the most Grammys of an artist ever with 32, but she's never taken out the big one, Album of the Year, and she's got stiff competition this year.
Yeah, so Charli XCX's Brat, Chappell Roan's The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess, Billie Eilish's Hit Me Hard and Soft, Taylor Swift's The Tortured Poets Department, and Sabrina Carpenter's Short and Sweet also going up against Bay's Cowboy Carter. Now, there are a couple of other nominations in that list, Andre 3000, and then I think like a classical album or something. I didn't recognise the name. But those are our pop girlies that we saw surge in 2024. So Beyonce's got a really tough ask to beat them. Look, next up in the most nods is Post Malone. He's got 8 this year. Billie Eilish and Kendrick Lamar have 7 nominations apiece, while Taylor Swift, Sabrina Carpenter and Chappell Roan all have 6 chances to win. And as for the Aussies, we are in it just in some minor categories, but we've got Troye Sivan, Tame Impala, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and Alpha Wolf all in with a shot at various awards. Now, I mentioned Charli XCX is in there for Album of the Year. She's actually heading down under this week. She's coming to play at Laneway Festivals, kicking off in Brisbane on Saturday, and then it's going to a few different places. Some of the shows are playing on like Monday and Tuesday, which you have to think are because they were desperate to have Charli perform, and they're like, yes, we'll do the festival on a Monday. Please, Charli, come to Australia. Our festival industry is dying. Now, if you do want to watch the Grammys, interestingly, they're not on free-to-air TV this year. I scoured the TV guide, something I haven't done for, 20 years. And it's not on Nine. Nine has the rights, but it's gone to Stan. So it's going to be exclusively on Stan from 11 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Time. But yeah, bad luck if you don't have Stan, you can't watch them. I'm sure there'll be a stream on YouTube somewhere. Chris, thank you. Next up, we are getting into our deep dive. Your deep dive, a really, really interesting chat with an incredible man who has survived. He says he's the only Western journalist to survive an ISIS beheading, and we're talking to him about the group and whether it's having a resurgence.
Throughout the 2010s, most, if not all of us, became aware of the terror group ISIS. At the height of its power, Islamic State controlled around 1/3 of Syria and just shy of half of Iraq. In population terms, that represented more than 10 million people under its rule. But ISIS's footprint and influence extended beyond the Middle East, with the group claiming responsibility for terror attacks around the world, like those in Paris in 2015, Berlin in 2016, and Manchester at an Ariana Grande concert the year after. Fast forward to 2018 though, when Donald Trump, just 2 years into his first presidency and after nearly 4 years of US troops fighting the group, made this declaration.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
After that, it felt like, at least here in the Western world, the group went somewhat quiet. Then, in 2024, ISIS was back in global headlines after claiming responsibility for the devastating attack on a Moscow shopping mall, Russia's deadliest terror event in 2 decades. In December last year, despite the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, Australia chose to end its decade-long joint operation with the US aimed at dismantling ISIS, the ADF claiming the region was starting to stabilise. But then, on New Year's Day, an ISIS-inspired attack killed 14 people and injured dozens more in New Orleans, seeming to confirm the fears of some experts that Islamic State was making a comeback. A man who says he witnessed the birth of ISIS firsthand and is the only Western journalist to escape one of their beheading attempts is Australian journalist Michael Ware. His award-winning documentary, Only the Dead, details his experience living in Iraq during the US invasion in 2003 and his closeness to Allied troops as well as those who were trying to kill them. Michael, welcome to the briefing. Is ISIS having a resurgence?
Well, Chris, yes and no. ISIS has been around since 2003 and it's still with us now. So they've never gone away. And they pulse in the nature of their attacks and the nature of their operations and in the campaigns they launch. I mean, we all remember that at the height of their power from 2013 to 2017, they actually established a caliphate, a country unto itself across much of Syria and northern Iraq that was the size of Great Britain. Now, US-backed local forces destroyed that caliphate, so they lost that. But they essentially redrew the map of the Middle East for about 4 years. But the Islamic State was here long before the caliphate, and the Islamic State is still here with us now. And the sad truth is that we accidentally, inadvertently, created and inflicted the Islamic State upon ourselves with our 2003 invasion of Iraq. And right now, today, we're helping propagate their message and radicalise their recruits with the algorithms in our social media.
I'm curious to know, because you spent almost 7 years living in Iraq, you were there during the invasion, you kind of watched and witnessed the whole country change, and in a way, a lot of the Middle East changed during that time. You have really unique first-hand experience. Can you explain a little bit what it was like witnessing that change?
Well, it just breaks your heart. There's no other way to describe it. I mean, my soul has been wounded in ways from which it can never recover. I was literally at the first ever Islamic State attack. It just so happens that in the part of Baghdad where the Time magazine house, I was working for Time magazine as a writer, happened to be. And we would hear bombs and you'd hear shooting all the time, but one morning there was this enormous sound. The whole house and neighbourhood shook, and you step outside and there's this vast, dark, black plume of smoke going up. So I raced towards it, and what did I find? The Islamic State's first suicide bombing. And it was an attack on the Jordanian embassy in Baghdad because the founder, Zarqawi, was Jordanian. Then, over time, I developed contacts with a whole range of insurgent groups that were fighting against the American occupation. And it was through those groups that I eventually made contact with the Islamic State and then with the founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi himself. In fact, I would send written questions to him and secret couriers would relay the answers back to me. When he made his first grand propaganda masterpiece, he personally sent it to me. A guy knocked on my door one night who was my Islamic State contact. He had a CD, untitled, in his hands, and it was a collection of behind-the-scenes suicide bombings where you met the bomber, you watch him prepare, hop in the truck, drive to the target and kill himself and as many others as he can. And I was also kidnapped by them and almost beheaded. As far as I know, I'm pretty much the only Westerner who ever survived a beheading. I was literally under the banner, guys with masks, bloke with a knife, and they were going to film my beheading with my own video camera. And then I was saved literally right at the last moment by local Iraqi fighters who are my friends. Iraq was the last pre-social media war. There was no such thing as Facebook. Twitter didn't exist. So they had ways to get their message out, mainly using Arabic networks like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and a couple of others. But they took me into their trust because, as I would say to them, same thing I said to the American soldiers, I'm just here to carry your voice and to tell your story. And I'm not going to distort that story. I'm not going to change your voice. I was an honest broker. I had to play a straight bat because if it was felt that I'd betrayed someone, they all knew where I lived and they would have come and taken me. I served the truth. There's no complete truth. In a sense, there's no such thing as truth. It's very subjective. But what I tried to do was go around and collect as many little shards of it, as many little pieces of the truth as I could to gain as best a picture as I possibly could. Because back then, when the Americans came in and removed Saddam, the American war machine had no idea why these people were shooting at them. That's what set me on this course that eventually led me to the Islamic State. The Americans go, we got rid of Saddam, we're here to bring you democracy, we want to help you rebuild. Why are you shooting at us? Literally, the American military intelligence had no idea. So I went out to ask them and find them and ask them, why are you launching this insurgency? And that led me to the Islamic State.
The brutality of the Islamic State was almost something like the world hadn't seen before in terms of terrorism, gathering the attention of, one of the most well-known terrorists who's saying, hey guys, you're going too far, this is too much. The brutality of it was intense and very new. Is that level of brutality and horror the same now when it comes to the Islamic State?
Well, we certainly saw it was during the Caliphate when they got to rule their own little country in precisely the way they wanted to run it, and you saw the violence that just bled out of that place. We assassinated Zarqawi June 6, 2006. We got information where we were sleeping one night and we dropped 2 500-pound bombs on that little farmhouse, incidentally killing a father, a mother and a couple of little kids about 8 and 5 years old. But with his death, the Islamic State didn't die because the power of the idea that he'd unleashed outlived him. Even now, we see it franchising itself around the world. I mean, right now you would argue that its strongest outfit is the Islamic State Khorasan, which is in Afghanistan, but they're in Somalia, they're in Mali, they're in the Congo, they're in the Caucasus, they're in Turkey, they're in Mozambique, they're in Russia. And one of the ways that they've been able to do that, to stay alive, to keep propagating their vicious idea of holy war and to keep grabbing new recruits to replenish and replenish and replenish, is their mastery of the message. Because that's what terrorism is. Terrorism are acts of violence designed to strike terror into the hearts of a population. And that's in this group's DNA. And they have an extremely sophisticated media and propaganda wing. Like clockwork, they put out a weekly magazine. It gives you updates on what it calls its provinces in the different parts of the world. And there's even a branch in Thailand, for goodness sake. I mean, just to give you an example, the last couple of weeks, so New Year's Eve, the Islamic State in Somalia launched a very sophisticated double car bombing attack with an infantry assault on Somali security forces. And the same night in New Orleans, a former American soldier hops in an electric vehicle and plunges into a crowd celebrating the new year. 7th of January in Central Africa, they executed 13 Christians. 4 days later, they tried to blow up a holy shrine in Syria. It goes on and on. But what is reaching out and touching us is the so-called lone wolf. Mm-hmm. Take the guy who plunged his car into celebrants on New Year's Eve in New Orleans. We have nothing to lead us to believe at this stage that he ever once had any single contact with the Islamic State. He was self-recruited, decided to do it himself in the name of the Islamic State, declared that and did it. They're the hardest kind of attackers to prevent. And that's one of the greatest dangers that we in the West face. In fact, the Islamic State organisation in Afghanistan currently has a big poster with a hand pointing a pistol at you, the observer, and it says, "Don't wait." And then it has a list of events and sites throughout Europe and America suggested as targets, including Oktoberfest and a whole series of concerts and sporting events.
I am curious to know, when it comes to other organisations like Hamas and Hezbollah, we have a pretty clear idea of what they want, what their motivations are, what their goals are. And to summarise it, it does relate to territory and geography. When it comes to ISIS, is their goal and their, MO just to cause terror?
No, it's to create an Islamic caliphate stretching from Andalusia in Spain all the way through to Indonesia. They want that to be one huge Muslim caliphate or kingdom. They want the removal of Israel. They want death to Christians, death to Shia Muslims. But it's a great question you ask, because someone like Hezbollah's fighting for Lebanon, right? They're attacking Israel. They want Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth. But they're fighting for Lebanon. And at the same time, they're running medical centres, health clinics, schools. They're providing services to the villages and the communities in which they live and operate. Same goes for Hamas. Hamas just wants Gaza and to get rid of Israel. Even the Taliban, as horrendous as the Taliban is, not before our invasion and not since our messy departure, never once has the Taliban launched a terror attack outside of Afghanistan.
How closely do you think ISIS is currently being monitored by the Australian government? And I ask this because at the end of last year, the ADF ended its decade-long operation with the US committed to dismantling ISIS. That was Operation Okra. Given that operation has ended, are we still keeping a close eye on this terrorist organisation in Australia?
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. And that's the point. ASIO at home and ISIS, our spy agencies, operate in the shadows. Trust me, they're not taking their eyes off Islamic State threats. And we're also part of the Five Eyes agreement, where 5 of the world's major democracies, us, America, Canada, New Zealand, join together and share all intelligence. Plus, because of our contributions and roles, first in Iraq and especially in Afghanistan, we have closer military and intelligence ties with the Americans than ever before in our history. So anything the Americans are picking up that might relate to us, they refer to us, and anything we're picking up, we're referring back. Let's not forget that right now, here where I'm sitting in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security says the greatest threat to me is a domestic terrorist. Someone who's fired up by right-wing politics, or an incel who's upset about this, or by an active shooter. Nonetheless, no one's taken their eyes off the Islamic State. In fact, the Americans just led an operation in Somalia the other day. They've still got forces in Syria specifically to try and keep the lid on ISIS and preventing them from re-emerging in Syria. And we're a part of that. Whether we have boots on the ground or not, we are a part of that.
And just briefly, Michael, before we let you go, and I don't want to get too fear-mongery, how vulnerable is Australia to an ISIS attack right now? Should we be more worried than what we are?
I would say no. In essence, nothing's changed since 2003. We've been living with this threat for 21 years now, and I suspect we'll continue to do so for another 21 years. In Australia, I would argue that the threat is less than it's what I'm facing right here now in America. I'd like to think that the radicalised Islamic extremist threat in Australia is less than it is here. But, mate, trust me, the threat remains.
Award-winning journalist and documentarian Michael Ware speaking with me there. And if you want to learn more about Michael's time in Iraq, his documentary is titled Only the Dead, and a little content warning, it does feature confronting and gruesome scenes. With that being said, that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our social posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Chris Spiru. Catch you next time.
Listener.